Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that every rule you lived by yesterday has been rewritten by a single individual. The stores are closed. The news is reading from a script you don't recognize, and your neighbors are suddenly looking at you with suspicion. This isn't the plot of a dystopian novel. It is the lived reality for billions of people throughout history. The story of the dictator is perhaps the most repetitive and predictable cycle in human civilization. It starts with a hero, a savior, or a protector, and it almost always ends in a bunker, a quiet exile, or a public square where the very people who once cheered now demand an accounting. Why does this keep happening? How does one person convince millions to hand over their freedom? And what is the secret chemistry that causes these iron grips to eventually shatter? Today, we are breaking down the anatomy of power, from the first spark of ambition to the final moment of collapse. To understand the rise of a dictator, you have to look at the soil they grow in. They don't just appear out of nowhere in a happy, thriving society. Dictators are the children of chaos. They are the answer to a question that a desperate population is asking. Usually that question is, who will make the hunger stop, or who will give us back our pride? Take the classic example of post-World War I Europe. You had nations that were humiliated, their economies in ruins, and their traditional leaders looking weak and indecisive. Into that vacuum steps a figure who doesn't speak like a politician. They speak like a force of nature. They don't offer nuanced policy debates. They offer a simple, powerful narrative of us versus them. The first step in the dictator's handbook is the creation of a crisis. If one doesn't exist, they find a small problem and blow it up until it fills the sky. They tell the people that there is a secret enemy working within their borders, some group that is responsible for all their misery. By giving the people a target for their anger, the aspiring dictator builds a bond of trust. I am the only one who sees the truth, they say, and I am the only one who can protect you from it. This is the moment where the crowds start to roar. It's an intoxicating feeling for a population that has felt ignored for years. They aren't just following a leader. They are joining a movement that promises to restore a golden age that probably never really existed in the first place. Once the dictator has the crowd, they need the machinery. You cannot rule by speeches alone. You need a group of people who are willing to do anything to stay in your good graces. This is where the inner circle comes in. In every historical rise to power, we see the recruitment of the disgruntled. These are the mid-level officers, the failed intellectuals, and the ambitious bureaucrats who feel the current system has passed them by. The dictator offers them a deal. Give me your absolute loyalty, and I will give you the power you've always craved. This creates a firewall between the leader and the people. The dictator becomes a symbol, while the inner circle does the heavy lifting of dismantling institutions. Now let's talk about the dismantling. This is the part where the frog is boiled slowly. An aspiring dictator rarely takes away all the rights at once. That would cause an immediate revolt. Instead, they go after the referees. They start with the journalists who ask difficult questions. They call them liars and enemies of the people. Then they move to the judges. They replace independent legal minds with loyalists who will interpret the law to suit the leader's whims. They change the election rules, just a little bit at first, to make sure the result is never in doubt. By the time the average citizen realizes the walls are closing in, the exit doors have already been locked. Communication is the oxygen of a dictatorship. Think about the massive rallies of the mid-20th century. The flags, the synchronized movement, the booming speakers. This isn't just for show. It's a psychological tactic designed to make the individual feel small and unimportant. When you are standing in a sea of 100,000 people all chanting the same name, it becomes very difficult to hold on to your own private doubts. You start to think that if everyone else believes this, they must be right. The dictator becomes the voice of the nation, and to disagree with the leader is to disagree with the country itself. This is how patriotism is weaponized into a tool of absolute control. But once you're at the top, how do you stay there? The middle of the dictator's journey is often a period of strange, artificial stability. This is when the grand projects begin. To prove their greatness, dictators love to build. They build massive monuments, 5-lane highways that lead to nowhere, and stadium-sized palaces. These are physical manifestations of their ego. They want the architecture to say, I am permanent. Look at the ancient world. Look at the emperors who built colosseums and arches. They were trying to manufacture a legacy that would outlast their own physical presence. During this phase, the economy might even seem to improve for a while because the leader is pouring every resource into immediate results, ignoring the long-term sustainability. It's a house of cards. But while the sun is shining, the cards look like solid walls. Then comes the paranoia. This is the inevitable turning point in every dictator's story. When you have no one above you and no one who can tell you no, you start to lose touch with reality. You begin to wonder if that general who clapped slightly too late at your last speech is plotting against you. You wonder if your deputy is looking at your chair with too much hunger. The history of power is littered with purges. The very people who helped the dictator rise are often the first ones to be discarded when the paranoia sets in. This creates a culture of fear that actually weakens the regime. Advisors become too afraid to give honest reports. If the harvest is failing, they tell the leader it's a record-breaking success because they don't want to be the messenger of bad news. The dictator begins to live in a fantasy world of their own making decisions based on false data and a growing sense of isolation. This isolation is usually what leads to the beginning of the fall. Dictators often overreach. They get bored with domestic control and start looking at the map. They decide that their greatness requires more territory, more glory. This leads to impulsive conflicts and international standing that gets more precarious by the day. They stop listening to their generals and start believing their own propaganda. They think they are invincible. But history shows that even the most fortified border cannot keep out the consequences of a bad decision. When a dictator pushes too hard against the rest of the world, others eventually push back. The fall of a dictator is rarely a quiet affair. It usually follows one of three paths. The first is the popular uprising. This happens when the economic house of cards finally collapses. When the people can no longer afford bread, the fear of the secret police is replaced by the fear of starvation. We've seen this countless times. A single event, perhaps a protest in a small town or an act of defiance by a street vendor, acts as a spark. Suddenly, the crowds aren't chanting the leader's name in praise. They are chanting it in anger. The inner circle, seeing the writing on the wall, has to make a choice. Do they go down with the ship, or do they try to save themselves by turning on their leader? When the military refuses to fire on the crowds, the game is over. The dictator who once seemed like a god is suddenly just an old man trying to find a way to the airport. The second path is the coup from within. This is the silent fall. The inner circle decides that the leader has become a liability. Maybe the leader's mental state has deteriorated, or they've led the country into a conflict that is draining the resources of the elite. In the middle of the night, the palace is surrounded by the very guards meant to protect it. The public might not even know what happened for days. They just wake up to find a new face on the television, promising to restore order. The cycle begins again, often with the new leader using the exact same playbook as the old one. The third path is external intervention. This is what happens when a dictator's ambition spills over the borders and becomes a problem for the neighbors. This usually ends in a massive conflict that levels the country the dictator was supposed to be protecting. This is the most catastrophic end, as the entire population pays the price for the leader's ego. In these cases, the fall is marked by the complete dismantling of the regime from the outside. The symbols of power are torn down, the statues are pulled into the dirt, and the dictator is either captured or disappears into history's shadow. Why do we keep falling for this pattern? It's because the promise of the dictator is very seductive. Life is complicated, and the world is a scary place. The idea that there is one person who has all the answers, who can simplify everything into a binary choice of loyalty or betrayal, is comforting to a certain part of the human psyche. We want to believe in heroes who can fix everything with a wave of their hand. But history teaches us that anyone who promises they are the only person who can save you is usually the person who will eventually destroy you. True stability doesn't come from the strength of one man, but from the strength of institutions that can survive the passing of any single individual. Think about the sheer variety of these figures across time. You have the monarchs who believed they were chosen by a higher power, the revolutionary leaders who claimed they were acting for the working class, and the modern strongmen who use social media to bypass traditional checks and balances. The costumes change, and the language evolves, but the underlying mechanisms remain remarkably consistent. They all rely on the cultivation of a personality cult. They want you to believe that the nation's identity is synonymous with their own. If you criticize them, you are attacking the country. This emotional blackmail is the most effective chain ever forged. The fall is also a lesson in the fragility of power. We often think of these regimes as monolithic and unbreakable, but they are built on the perception of strength. As soon as that perception is shattered, the whole structure can disappear in an afternoon. This is why dictators are so obsessed with image. They need to look young, strong, and in control at all times perfectly. They can't afford to look weak, because weakness is an invitation to the next ambitious person waiting in the wings. This constant need to project strength is exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. The aftermath of a dictatorship is often just as messy as the rise. When a single individual has been the only source of authority for decades, their absence leaves a massive hole. The institutions that were supposed to govern have been hollowed out. The people have forgotten how to disagree without violence. This is why many countries slide back into another dictatorship shortly after the first one falls. Rebuilding a society that can handle freedom is much harder than following a leader who tells you exactly what to do. But there is a silver lining in this long, dark history. No matter how many dictators rise, they almost always fail eventually. The human desire for autonomy, for a voice in one's own destiny, is a fire that can be dampened but never truly extinguished. The iron-fisted ruler might last for 20, 30, or even 40 years, but in the grand timeline of history, they are just a temporary aberration. The walls they build eventually crumble. The secrets they hide eventually come to light, and the people they suppressed eventually find their voice again. We see this cycle in every corner of the globe, from the ancient city-states of Greece to the modern territories of the 21st century. The story is the same. A man promises to be a protector, becomes a master, and ends as a cautionary tale. The rise and fall of these figures is a mirror held up to our own societies. It asks us what we value more, the comforting lie of a strong man or the difficult truth of a democracy. It challenges us to recognize the early warning signs of a dictator's rise, the rhetoric of division, the attack on the truth, and the consolidation of power in the hands of the few. If there is one lesson to take away, it's that power is a loan, not a gift. When a leader forgets that, when they start to believe that they are the source of power rather than its temporary guardian, the timer on their downfall begins to tick. The rise is fast and exciting, the middle is heavy and fearful, and the fall is sudden and often final. We've seen this script played out over and over again, and yet every new generation thinks they are the ones who have finally found a leader who is different. But history is a stubborn teacher. It shows us that the anatomy of power doesn't change, only the names and the dates. Consider the end of these figures. When the dust settles, what remains? Usually it's a country that has to find its way back from the brink. The lessons learned are burned into the cultural memory. Some nations emerge stronger, creating systems specifically designed to prevent a repeat performance. They build constitutions that separate powers. They protect a free press with everything they have. And they cultivate a citizenry that is skeptical of any politician who claims to be a savior. Others are not so lucky, and they find themselves caught in a revolving door of strongmen, each one promising to fix the mess left by the last one. The study of dictators is really the study of human psychology. It's about our relationship with authority and our fear of the unknown. As long as there are people who feel hopeless, there will be someone willing to capitalize on that hopelessness by promising a shortcut to greatness. The allure of the dictator is the allure of the easy answer. But the easy answer always comes with a price that is too high to pay. The loss of individuality, the loss of truth, and eventually, the loss of the very stability that was promised in the first place. When we look at the rise and fall across history, we see a pattern of hubris. Every dictator believes they are the exception. They believe they have found the secret to eternal rule. They surround themselves with yes-men who confirm their delusions. They ignore the warnings from the past. And then, one day, the reality of the situation catches up with them. The soldiers stop saluting. The crowds stop cheering. And the palace walls feel very thin. This is the moment where the legend ends and the person remains, facing the consequences of the world they built. It is fascinating to see how the fall impacts the collective memory. Some dictators are remembered with a strange kind of nostalgia, a longing for the perceived order of their reign. This usually happens when the transition to whatever comes next is particularly difficult. Others are erased from history as quickly as possible, their names scrubbed from buildings and their statues turned into scrap metal. But whether remembered or forgotten, their impact is undeniable. They leave behind a legacy of trauma and transformation that shapes the future for generations. In the end, the story of every dictator's rise and fall is a reminder of the power of the people. It takes the consent, or at least the silence, of millions to allow one person to take control. And it takes the collective will of those same millions to bring the curtain down. The dictator doesn't exist in a vacuum. They are a reflection of the society they lead. If we want to understand the rise of the next strongman, we shouldn't just look at the person on the podium. We should look at the people in the audience and ask what they are so afraid of that they are willing to trade their freedom for a feeling of safety. The rise is about the exploitation of fear. The fall is about the return of hope, and the long gap in between is where the real history is made, not in the decrees of the leader, but in the quiet acts of resistance and the slow rebuilding of the human spirit. The dictator might own the headline, but the people own the story, and that story always moves toward the light, eventually. Even in the most modern contexts, where technology gives a leader more tools for surveillance and control than any ancient emperor could have dreamed of, the fundamentals don't change. You can monitor every phone call and track every movement, but you cannot control what people think in their own minds. You cannot force people to truly believe a lie forever. The more pressure you put on a population, the more heat you generate. Eventually, that heat will lead to an explosion. It might take years, or it might take decades, but the laws of political physics are as constant as the laws of gravity. What goes up on the back of populism and fear must eventually come down when the reality of governance fails to match the fantasy of the promise. The rise and fall of a dictator is a cycle that has defined the human experience for as long as we have lived in organized groups. It's a drama that is played out on the world stage with terrifying regularity. By understanding the mechanics of this cycle, we aren't just learning about the past, we are arming ourselves for the future. We are learning how to spot the cracks in the foundation before the house is even built. We are learning that the most expensive thing in the world is a free lunch promised by a politician with a loud voice and a finger pointed at someone else. As the final chapters of these regimes are written, there is always a sense of inevitability. Looking back, we can see exactly where it went wrong. We can see the moment the leader lost their way, the moment the people had enough, and the moment the forces of the world aligned to bring about a change. It's easy to judge the past with the benefit of hindsight, but the real challenge is to apply those lessons to our own lives and our own systems. The story of power is never finished. It is being written right now, in every corner of the world, as new leaders rise and old ones struggle to hold on. The stage is different, but the actors are following a script that is thousands of years old, and the ending, though it may take its time to arrive, is always the same. The strength of the individual can never truly replace the strength of the collective. The shadow of the dictator is long, but it is always eventually overtaken by the dawn of a new day. Understanding that journey, from the first hopeful cheer to the final silent departure, is the key to understanding the heart of history itself.